Hi guys, Max here. 7 years ago I made this showcase video and today I finally found the time to respond to the tutorial requests. So I'm going to make those pants, since I think pants are even harder to make compared to shoes. I'm using this scan data as collision mesh. I decimated it a little bit, otherwise the collision calculation is going to be slow. The model has a correct scale, but for some reason I get better result if I scale it up 10 times. Let's freeze the scale. Since cloth simulation in Blender is not interactive and every modification means to redo the cloth from scratch, I always draw a reference with grease pencil to define pattern, seams and pocket. Let's activate the snap-on surface and let's start drawing. At this stage, it's a good idea to activate the mirror modifier. I'll speed up the video a little bit. Alright, now let's apply the mirror modifier and draw the fly line. I don't like the shape of the pockets, so I deleted this one and I now draw the new one. Now duplicate it and scale on the x-axis at -1 using the center of the world. Good, I have a base reference for my pants. Now I usually manually retopologize the geometry by following as much as possible the seam guides. I start with the belt. Let's align it to the reference. Now with the help of the shrink wrap modifier, I'm going to snap it to the surface. Good. To add a bit of distance from the collision mesh, I usually use the displacement modifier. Now let's continue with the modeling process. A very important factor is to have an even grid distribution. In this way, the simulation will be consistent along the entire model. I try to work with the least amount of polygon at this stage. Now, I duplicate the shrink wrap modifier and I apply the previous one. In this way, the snap-on surface works better. In fact, now, even if I turn off the shrink wrap modifier, the model now stays in place. Let's also assign a mirror modifier to speed up the process. Put it on top of the list to have the clipping feature work properly. Let's proceed with the modeling. To get the best out of the retopology experience, I always activate the brand new retopology overlay. The top part of the pants is usually the more tedious to model. Once that is defined, the tubes for the legs are coming along. Let's make it flat. Now let's extrude it down. Add a bunch of loops. Turn off the retopology overlay and proceed with the sculpt tool to define the shape better. To smooth the loops, I often use the Asset Flow Free add-on. Achieve a good shape at this stage is crucial to get a better simulation result later. Let's start marking some seams. This is needed to define the sewing lines and the unwrap. Now I will cut the front pockets with the knife tool. To cut the fly line, I have to apply the mirror modifier. Don't worry about the triangles, the subdivision modifier will make the mesh all quads. Let me rename the geometry and organize a bit the outliner. I always create a backup folder where I put a copy of the geometry before performing a destructive operation. With the subdivision modifier, I achieve a good density for my simulation. I can check it by turning off the optimal display option. I can subdivide it even more, but I'm afraid to get unrealistic thin folds. I will also make the pants longer to get some ripples around the ankles. I'm also going to make the pants the tighter around the calves. As you can see, the see-through visualization is extremely convenient to check the gap between the collision mesh and the cloth. Having a bit of intersection is not a big deal. It means that it's going to be tight around that area. This is my base model. Now let's create the fabric pattern. I can easily select the single patches using the seams boundaries. I duplicate the selection and create a new piece of geo. To avoid the rounded corners, I activate the Keep Corners option in the Subdivision Surface modifier. Now let's put the pattern in a new dedicated folder. I'll make it invisible so every time I put something in, it will be automatically hidden. Now let's proceed with the other patches. Some parts of the cloth are going to share the same geometry, for example, part of the inside of the pocket and the front part of the pants. The Keep Corners option doesn't work with concave topology, so the crease tool will help in this case. In this case, the fly areas belong to the left and right side of the pants, so it's necessary to duplicate it twice. Good, here I have all the patches. Let's do some outliner cleanup. Activate the outline option to check the overlapping patches. Let's create a new material for the pants. Here I forgot that also the shank button area must overlap. So let's duplicate the polygon on one side and paste into the other. This is the situation. Now let's duplicate it and put it in the backup folder. The next step will be to apply all the modifiers. Now I will merge everything together and freeze all the transformations. It's time to create the sewing lines. I usually do it with bridge loops and F2 tools, then I delete the faces with the Only Faces option. The sewing process is boring, but it requires a lot of attention, especially in areas where patches are overlapping, like this one here. This is also another reason why I usually don't go very high in poly count with cloth simulation. Having to deal with a great amount of polygons is not a pleasant experience. I'm going to make some mistake eventually, like in this case. Unfortunately, only the experience will help you find them sooner than later. Sorry, here I have to remake the belt band sewings because I clearly missed something. This should be correct. Now let's fake the button with some other sewing lines. Again, imagine if you have to deal with a more dense mesh, this would be a very poor experience. Good, I have all the sewing in place. Now let me assign some physical properties to the objects. The collision to the collision mesh, I usually increase the friction value and fix the collision distance that is expressed in meters. Keep in mind that I scaled up the mesh 10 times. For the pants, I usually use some cloth preset, in this case the denim one. I briefly turn off the gravity. I'll work on it later. In the collision panel, I activate the self-collision and I fix the distance and the friction. Now activate the sewing option. Let's put 10 as value, which works fine in most cases. Now they unwrap. It's fundamental to generate the flat pattern in viewport. These are my UV. Let's make them straight. Distribution is not very important, but still. Now let's create a checker map to check if they are facing the correct direction. Let's open the material editor so I can plug the check map in the base color channel. Alright, everything looks fine. Now I'll use a geometry node preset to morph the UAV into geometry. You find the link in the description. Drag and drop onto the geometry and put the factor at 1 to make it flat as in the UV editor. As always, let's make a backup copy and apply the modifier. Now I have to align the pattern to the collision mesh. The sewing lines will help me to define the correct position of each island. It's better to give some priority to the tight parts, such as around the ankles, in order to have a correct racking of the cloth. So now let's solve the feet intersection. I'll create a new shape kit. Now in sculpt mode, with the help of the pose and move brushes, I will drag the feet down a bit. There is no need to make anything precise. Now, as you guessed, I will place a couple of keyframes to define a collision animation. Ideally, I put the keyframe in a place where I suppose the main sewing simulation is completed. 5-frame range should be enough. Now in the cloth properties, let's add the gravity animation that should start later on. 10-frame range should be enough. The lack of gravity in the beginning should help the cloth to stay more or less in place, while the high value of friction should prevent it to fall down too much later on. Let's turn on the cloth visibility toggles and run the first round of simulation. Okay, not bad at all as first take. There are few errors here and there, but nothing too bad. First thing, the pocket were on the outside, so it's better to detach the pocket flaps and make them as separated pieces way closer to the body. This means that I have to remake the sewing connections. I also noticed that 2 pieces of the waistband are flipped. Let's realign them very quickly. Let's run another test. Better. Now the pockets are inside the pants, but I have a problem around the button. Let's double check the sewing lines. Everything looks fine. Now, what if I want to have more resolution? I can apply a level of subdivision surface modifier. But as you can see, I would have to add all the missing sewing lines. Also, in Blender, it's not ideal to go too high in cloth resolution. Instead, I will poke the faces to increase the resolution a bit. With Alt-J, I quadrify the geometry and no need to touch the sewing lines. Let's compare the old with the new version. Let's check how better it will look. Not bad. Now it's time to address minor fixes. Let me try to increase the friction a bit. I retained a bit more of the folds behind the knees. I spotted an issue on the back that unfortunately will require a fix in the geometry. It is not ideal to change the geometry at this stage because the polygon density will change and the patterns are tilted in weird ways. So for major fixes, it's always better to go back to the original blockout shape. In this case, it's really a minor thing in place where not much folds will appear anyway. Let's bake another round. Good. Here are my pants. Now I should close the small gaps generated by the sewing lines, but it will generate a lot of manifolds edges. That's all, folks. I'll see you next time. Bye.